Welcome to my channel, and today I want to share a story that will inspire you to never give up on your dreams, no matter how impossible they may seem. This is the story of a young boy who refused to let doubt or circumstance stop him, a story of faith, hard work, and unwavering determination that led him to achieve what many thought could never be done. Let's start in the heart of a lively West African town called Kansolo, where red earth roads twisted between crowded markets and distant green fields. There lived a young boy named Adebayo Kofi Mensah, a child whose eyes carried questions bigger than the sky, and whose heart held dreams far larger than the world expected of him. And though Kansolo was always noisy with traders shouting prices, children laughing, and radios humming old melodies, Adebayo often felt like he was walking alone inside his own future, because he was the son of a man whose life never stayed in one place for long, a hard-working horse handler named Kofi Mensah, who traveled endlessly from one rural training ground to another, from ceremonial racing fields to private farms owned by wealthy men who valued strong horses, but rarely valued the people who trained them. And because of this wandering life, Adebayo's childhood was stitched together from half-finished friendships, unfamiliar classrooms, and schools where teachers barely remembered his name before he was forced to leave again. And every time he arrived in a new town, carrying his small bag and worn books, he had to learn how to survive once more. Learn new rules, learn new faces, and learn how to stay quiet when others laughed at his accent or mocked his constant transfers. Yet even as his body moved from place to place, his mind remained fixed on one unshakable vision. A vision that had grown inside him since he was old enough to understand his father's work. A dream of one day owning a vast horse estate of his own, where horses would not be tools for profit, but partners treated with dignity. Where land would stretch endlessly under the sun, and children like him would learn without fear that their roots were too weak to grow strong. And while other boys dreamed of quick wealth or city fame, Adebayo dreamed of land, discipline, patience, and legacy. A dream shaped by early mornings, watching his father clean stables with tired hands, and late evenings listening to stories told under flickering lantern light about resilience, endurance, and faith in tomorrow. Adebayo's schooling was anything but stable, and by the time he turned 13, he had attended more schools than he could count on his fingers, each one leaving behind fragments of unfinished lessons and teachers who saw him only as a temporary presence. But despite these disruptions, he remained unusually focused, always asking questions that reached beyond textbooks, always sketching horses in the margins of his notebooks, and always staring beyond classroom windows as if the horizon itself was calling his name. And it was during one such school year in Kansolo Central Academy that his life quietly approached a defining moment. A moment that would test whether dreams were meant only to be imagined or boldly defended. Because one afternoon, his teacher, Mr. Solomon Adusei, a respected but stern man who believed deeply in practicality and order, announced an assignment that seemed harmless at first, instructing every student to write an essay describing their dream and the future they hoped to achieve. And while the classroom buzzed with excitement as students whispered about becoming doctors, traders, soldiers, and politicians, Adebayo sat silently, his heart beating faster, because for the first time, someone had asked him to place his dream into words, to give shape to the vision he had carried quietly for years. That evening, under the dim glow of a kerosene lamp in their modest home, Adebayo worked with rare intensity, writing page after page with careful handwriting, describing in vivid detail a massive horse estate covering hundreds of acres with training fields, stables, a family home, and wide paths where horses could run freely. And he did not stop there, because words alone felt insufficient. So he sketched maps of the land, measured distances, and imagined systems that would allow both people and animals to thrive together. And though his hands ached and sleep tried to pull his eyelids closed, he continued, driven by a quiet certainty that this dream mattered enough to deserve his full effort. And when he finally placed his pen down near dawn, he looked at the 7-page essay before him not as an assignment, but as a promise to himself. The next day, Adebayo submitted his work with confidence, unaware that this single decision would place him at the crossroads between surrender and conviction. And when the essays were returned days later, the classroom fell silent as students scanned their grades, some smiling, others sighing. And then Adebayo's breath caught in his chest, as he saw a large red mark on his paper, a mark that felt heavier than ink, because written boldly across the front page was a failing grade, accompanied by a brief instruction telling him to see the teacher after class. And though he tried to remain composed, something inside him cracked, because for the first time, someone had not merely doubted his circumstances, but his vision itself. After the final bell rang, Adebayo approached Mr. Aduse's desk, his steps hesitant but his posture upright. And when he asked why he had failed, the teacher looked at him with measured calm and explained that his dream was unrealistic for someone of his background, that his family lacked wealth, stability and influence, and that dreaming so far beyond one's means was not wisdom, but foolishness, advising him to rewrite the essay with a more achievable goal, if he wished to pass. And though the words were spoken without cruelty, they struck Adebayo with a force that followed him home that evening, where he sat silently, staring at the pages that had once filled him with hope. Kwame Mensah noticed his son's silence immediately, because a father who spends his life reading animals learns to read people too. And when Adebayo finally shared the story, his father listened without interruption, his expression thoughtful rather than angry. And after a long pause, he spoke words that would quietly guide the rest of his son's life, explaining that the world often fears dreams it cannot understand, that many people abandon their hopes because they were taught to do so by disappointment, and that while changing the essay might bring an easy grade, changing the dream might lead to a lifetime of regret, leaving the final decision in Adebayo's hands, not as a command, but as trust. For days, Adebayo wrestled with doubt, weighing the comfort of approval against the cost of surrender, and when the deadline arrived, he made his choice, returning the same essay unchanged, accepting the consequences with steady resolve. And though the teacher did not reverse the grade, something unseen shifted that day, because a seed had been planted, not only in Adebayo's future, but in the silent spaces of every life his journey would later touch. Years passed quietly, not marked by celebration or sudden miracles, but by the steady rhythm of endurance, and after that, school year ended. Adebayo Kofi Mensah once again followed his father onto the long roads of Ghana's countryside, moving between training grounds and farms, where horses were raised for festivals, private competitions, and ceremonial parades. And though the red F from his essay never left his memory, it no longer felt like a wound, but like a silent challenge that pushed him forward every morning. Because while other boys measured success by praise or approval, Adebayo learned early that real progress often grows in places where no one is watching. And as his body matured through hard labor, his mind sharpened through observation, watching how land was managed, how animals responded to care or neglect, and how discipline shaped outcomes more than luck ever could. Kwame Mensah taught his son everything he knew, not through formal lessons but through example, showing him how to read a horse's posture, how to sense fatigue before injury, how patience could calm even the wildest stallion, and how consistency turned effort into mastery. And during evenings under the open sky, Kwame would speak about dignity in work, reminding Adebayo that greatness was not about where one started, but about how one carried responsibility. And those words became the foundation of Adebayo's character, shaping him into a young man who respected both labor and learning. And even when formal education became irregular due to constant travel, he continued studying on his own, borrowing books, asking questions, and writing notes wherever he could, because he understood that knowledge, like land, only grows when cultivated. As Adebayo entered his late teenage years, opportunities remained scarce, and many people who knew him expected little more than a continuation of his father's path, assuming he would remain a hired worker all his life, moving wherever work called him. But deep inside, his vision never faded, and whenever he closed his eyes, he could still see the wide fields of his future estate, hear the hooves pounding freely against the earth, and feel the quiet satisfaction of building something that would outlive him. And it was during this period that hardship tested him most severely, because Kwame fell ill after years of physical strain, leaving Adebayo to shoulder greater responsibility, managing work, caring for his father, and earning enough to survive. And though fear whispered that his dream might need to be postponed or abandoned, he refused to let circumstances dictate his destiny. With limited resources but endless determination, Adebayo began saving small amounts of money from every job, sometimes choosing hunger over comfort, sometimes walking long distances instead of paying for transport, and he kept his savings hidden in a small wooden box, not as money, but as proof that his future was being built one sacrifice at a time. And he also began networking quietly, forming respectful relationships with landowners, veterinarians, traders, and fellow handlers. Always listening more than speaking, always observing how decisions were made, because he knew that understanding systems mattered as much as working within them. And while others dismissed him as overly serious, those who paid attention noticed his reliability, his discipline, and his refusal to cut corners. Time continued its steady march forward, and when Kwame eventually passed away, Adebayo mourned not only a father, but the man who had shaped his principles, and though grief weighed heavily on him, it also strengthened his resolve. Because now his dream carried greater meaning, transforming from personal ambition into a tribute to the life that had guided him. And with renewed focus, he sought opportunities beyond daily labor, eventually securing a position assisting a respected breeder named Yo Bediako, a man known for combining traditional knowledge with modern methods. And under Yo's mentorship, Adebayo learned advanced training techniques, breeding strategies, and land management practices that deepened his understanding of what it truly meant to run a large-scale operation. Years later, through persistence, trust, and careful saving, Adebayo managed to lease a small piece of land on the outskirts of Kansolo, not the vast estate of his dreams, but enough to begin. And standing on that land for the first time, he felt the same certainty he had felt when writing his childhood essay, because he understood that dreams do not arrive fully formed, but grow through stages, and with his own hands, he built modest stables, acquired his first 2 horses, and began operating independently, facing countless setbacks, including droughts, financial losses, and skepticism from those who doubted his vision. Yet each challenge only refined his strategy, strengthening his resilience and sharpening his leadership. As word spread about his ethical treatment of horses and disciplined training methods, his reputation slowly grew, attracting clients who valued quality over shortcuts. And with each success, Adebayo reinvested into his operation, expanding land, improving facilities, and mentoring young workers who reminded him of himself. And though progress was gradual, it was undeniable, because every step was grounded in purpose rather than haste. And one day, standing on land that now stretched far beyond his original lease, Adebayo realized that he was no longer chasing his dream, but living inside it. And yet, even as his success became visible, he remained grounded, keeping his old essay carefully folded among his belongings. Not as a reminder of rejection, but as evidence that faith combined with action could transform even the most unlikely future. As Adebayo Kofi Mensah's work began to draw attention beyond Kansolo, his life entered a phase where success no longer came quietly, but arrived with responsibility, expectation, and scrutiny, because when people started to see visible results, they also began to measure him against standards he had never been offered in his youth. And though his expanding horse grounds were still modest compared to his childhood vision, the discipline and order within them reflected a mind that had never forgotten its purpose. And every fence post, every stable door, and every carefully trained horse stood as proof that growth rooted in patience could not be shaken by doubt. With time, regional competitions began inviting Adebayo to present his horses. And while he never sought recognition, he understood that visibility could open doors. So he prepared meticulously, focusing not on winning trophies, but on demonstrating quality. And when his horses performed with strength and composure, observers took notice, including investors and agricultural officials, who saw in him not only talent, but integrity. A rare combination that built trust faster than ambition alone ever could. And still, despite these opportunities, Adebayo refused shortcuts, turning down offers that demanded compromised standards, because he remembered too well how easily dreams could be distorted when approval became the goal. It was during this period that Adebayo was invited to attend a regional agricultural development forum, a gathering of landowners, policymakers, and educators, where discussions centered around sustainable practices and youth training. And though he felt out of place among men in tailored clothing and polished shoes, he spoke honestly about his journey, emphasizing the importance of mentorship access and belief. and his words carried weight precisely because they were not rehearsed, but lived. And by the end of the forum, several participants approached him, offering support, partnerships, and guidance that would later prove pivotal in his expansion. Gradually, land acquisition became possible, not through sudden wealth, but through calculated agreements, leases that turned into purchases, and trust built over years of consistency. And when Adebayo finally stood on a stretch of land that mirrored the scale of the one he had once drawn as a boy, he did not celebrate loudly, because he understood that fulfillment was not found in arrival, but in responsibility, and he immediately began planning not only for horses, but for people. Designing training programs for young workers from unstable backgrounds, offering them structure, skill, and dignity, because he knew that dreams multiplied when shared. One afternoon, as the estate neared full operation, a group of educators visited the grounds with students on a learning trip, and among them was an elderly man whose face stirred a memory Adebayo had not revisited in years. And as recognition dawned, he realized it was Mr. Solomon Adusei, his former teacher, now retired. Walking slowly with the aid of a cane, and when their eyes met, time seemed to fold in on itself, because standing before them was not just land and horses, but the physical manifestation of a moment long past, and the teacher stood in silence, taking in the vast fields, the structured stables, and the quiet authority with which Adebayo moved among his workers. Eventually, Mr. Adusei approached him, his voice low and unsteady, and confessed that he had once graded a boy's dream instead of his effort, that fear disguised as realism had guided his judgment, and that seeing this estate forced him to confront the dreams he had abandoned and the many students he had discouraged along the way. And as he spoke, regret softened his features. And when he finished, Adebayo listened without resentment, because time had taught him that forgiveness was not weakness, but freedom. And he responded not with triumph, but with humility, explaining that doubt often comes from wounded hope, and that dreams only fail when people stop defending them. As the visit ended, Mr. Adusei stood once more at the edge of the land, tears reflecting years of unspoken regret, and he thanked Adebayo not for proving him wrong, but for reminding him what belief looked like when it was protected instead of dismissed. And when the teacher left, Adebayo returned to his work, unchanged in posture but deepened in understanding, because he knew that his journey had become more than personal success. It had become a lesson larger than words. That evening, inside his completed home overlooking the estate, Adebayo placed a framed document above the fireplace, the same childhood essay once marked with failure, preserved not as a trophy, but as a reminder. And as the fire crackled softly, he reflected on the truth he had lived, that dreams grow strongest when nourished by faith, effort, and patience, and that no voice, no matter how authoritative, has the right to shrink what the heart knows is possible. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by the reality of a vision once doubted, Adebayo felt complete, not because he had reached the end, but because he had honored the beginning. As the seasons continued to turn over the land that now bore his name, Mensah Plains, Adebayo Kofi Mensah's life settled into a rhythm that blended responsibility with quiet fulfillment, and though success had finally embraced him fully, it never changed the simplicity of his spirit, because each morning he still walked the fields before sunrise, listening to the earth greeting the horses by name, and reminding himself that nothing he had built belonged to pride, but to purpose. And over the years, the estate grew into more than a ranch, becoming a center of learning where young men and women from struggling backgrounds came to train, study, and rediscover belief in themselves. And many arrived, broken by rejection, much like Adebayo once had been, carrying invisible scars from voices that told them their dreams were too big, too foolish, or too distant from reality. And it was here, under Adebayo's guidance, that those voices slowly lost their power, replaced by discipline, skill, and a renewed sense of possibility. Adebayo never lectured about success because he believed life taught best through example, and so he worked alongside everyone, showing that leadership was not distance but presence. And as the years passed, his estate became widely respected across the region, attracting visitors from distant towns, agricultural boards, and educational institutions who wanted to understand how a boy from an unstable background had built something so enduring. And whenever he was asked to speak, Adebayo always returned to the same truth, that dreams alone were not enough, but when paired with faith, sacrifice, and relentless effort, they became plans rather than fantasies, and his words carried weight because they were backed by soil-stained hands and years of perseverance. One quiet evening, as rain tapped gently against the windows of his large home and firelight filled the room with warmth, Adebayo sat alone near the fireplace, gazing at the framed essay that had followed him from childhood into fulfillment, and in that moment, memories of his father, his teachers, his hardships, and his sacrifices flowed together. Not with bitterness, but with gratitude, because he understood that every obstacle had shaped him, every doubt had strengthened him, and every delay had refined his patience. And he smiled softly, knowing that the boy who once refused to rewrite his dream had grown into a man who had rewritten expectations instead. As word of his journey spread, countless young people found courage in his story, realizing that limitations imposed by others only hold power when accepted, and that destiny often waits patiently for those brave enough to defend their vision. And even as age slowly crept into Adebayo's steps, his passion never dimmed, because he knew that the true measure of success was not what one achieved alone, but what one made possible for others. And long after the noise of the world faded into silence, Mensah Plains remained standing, not just as land and buildings, but as living proof that unwavering belief could turn the impossible into reality. And so Adebayo Kofi Mensah's story did not end with applause or wealth, but with legacy written not on paper, but across lives changed, dreams awakened, and futures restored. Reminding anyone willing to listen that no dream is too large when the heart refuses to surrender, that faith combined with effort creates its own path, and that those who dare to protect their vision, even when the world doubts them, are the ones who ultimately shape the world itself. Though Mensah Plains had already become a symbol of perseverance and ethical leadership, Adebayo Kofi Mensah never allowed himself to believe that the journey was complete, because he understood that growth was not a destination, but a responsibility that demanded constant renewal. And as younger generations began arriving at the estate in increasing numbers, seeking guidance, employment, or simply hope, Adebayo recognized that his dream had expanded beyond land and horses into something far more complex, something rooted in human potential. And so he began developing structured programs that combined education, discipline, and character building, ensuring that those who passed through his estate left not only with skills, but with belief restored. And this initiative slowly transformed Mensah Plains into a respected institution, drawing attention from educators and leaders who had once dismissed such ambitions as unrealistic. The challenges, however, did not disappear simply because success had arrived, because with visibility came opposition, jealousy, and pressure from powerful interests who wanted control over his land or influence over his methods. And Adebayo faced moments when compromise seemed tempting, moments when easier paths were offered in exchange for silence or conformity. Yet each time he returned to the principles instilled by his father and forged through struggle, choosing integrity over convenience, even when it cost him financially or socially. And this consistency, though difficult, preserved the soul of everything he had built. As years passed, Adebayo's hair slowly grayed, and his steps became more deliberate, but his presence remained commanding. And one evening, while walking the fields at sunset, he realized that the dream he once defended alone was now protected by many, by students, workers, and families whose lives had been reshaped through opportunity. And in that realization, he found peace, knowing that even if he were to step away, the values he planted would continue to grow. With time, Adebayo began delegating responsibilities to trusted protégés, young men and women who had risen through the estate's programs and embodied the discipline and vision he valued. And this transition was not easy, because letting go required as much courage as holding on. Yet he understood that legacy demanded continuity rather than control. And as leadership expanded, Mensah Plains evolved into a cooperative network, supporting surrounding communities through training initiatives, fair employment, and sustainable practices. And slowly, the region itself began to change, reflecting the ripple effect of one dream protected long enough to mature. During this phase of life, Adebayo was often invited to speak at schools and community gatherings, and when he stood before children whose eyes mirrored his own childhood uncertainty, he spoke not of success, but of persistence, explaining that dreams are often challenged not because they are impossible, but because they threaten comfort. And he urged them to measure their lives not by approval, but by purpose, and many who listened carried those words quietly, just as he once had, planting seeds that would grow in their own time. One afternoon, while sorting through old belongings, Adebayo came across his father's worn tools, and holding them, he felt the full weight of the journey, understanding that without those early lessons of humility and labor, none of this would have been possible. And in that moment, gratitude filled him more deeply than pride ever could. As the world around Mensah Plains modernized, with technology reshaping industries and traditions slowly fading, Adebayo faced a final challenge, balancing progress with preservation, and he worked tirelessly to integrate innovation without erasing the values that defined the estate, ensuring that advancement served people rather than replacing them. And this balance became his final contribution, teaching future leaders that progress without principles leads to emptiness. Health concerns eventually forced Adebayo to slow down. And though he resisted at first, he accepted that even strong foundations must eventually trust what they have built. And surrounded by those he had mentored, he transitioned fully into an advisory role, offering wisdom rather than instruction, and watching from a distance as the estate thrived without his constant presence, confirming that his dream had outgrown him, just as it was meant to. In quiet moments, Adebayo often returned to the fireplace where the framed essay still hung, unchanged, and he smiled at the irony that what was once marked as failure had become a roadmap for generations. And he felt no resentment toward the past, only understanding. Because without resistance, belief would never have learned to stand firm. In his later years, Adebayo Kofi Mensah spent more time observing than acting, listening to the sounds of life he had helped shape, the laughter of trainees, the steady rhythm of hooves, and the wind moving freely across the land. And he understood then that true success was not measured by expansion, recognition, or wealth, but by continuity of purpose, and when his time finally came to rest, he did so peacefully, knowing that his dream no longer depended on his presence because it lived within the values, systems, and people he had nurtured. Mensah Plains endured not merely as land, but as a living testament to unwavering faith, disciplined effort, and the courage to defend a vision when doubt stood loudest. And long after his passing, his story continued to be told, not as a tale of impossible success, but as proof that dreams survive when they are protected, worked for, and shared, and that no voice has the power to limit a future unless it is allowed to. And in this way, Adebayo Kofi Mensah's life became more than a story. It became a message carried forward by every dreamer who refused to surrender. Thank you for listening to this inspiring journey. Remember, no dream is too big or too small if you are willing to work for it and never give up, even when others doubt you. Let this story remind you that challenges are only stepping stones, and perseverance, faith, and determination can turn the impossible into reality. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, comment, and share it with someone who needs encouragement today. If you like this story, make sure you subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share with your friends and family so you don't let miss the next powerful story coming your way. Drop a heart in comment, like and subscribe my channel, and visit my channel for more interesting story videos.